Today is the 11th of February 2013. We're here at the School of Architecture in St. Lucia interviewing Max Bannah. Interviewing you is Robert Riddel and myself, Janina, Gosseye. So our first question is, what architecture qualifications did you gain, or if any, and from which institutions, or where did you study?
Well, I was a student here in University of Queensland in the mid-60s. I started here in the mid-60s, and I left in the fifth year of this course.
Which is the final year?
No, remember it was 6 years. It was 3 years full-time and 3 years part-time.
Okay.
And it was during the fifth year that I left architecture. So I don't have any qualification. At that stage they used to have I think a Bachelor of Design Studies that came perhaps in the late 70s. But prior to that, you either finished the course or you didn't. And I didn't finish, I moved on. But if I can talk just generally then about the course, I'm not sure. Well, I moved into, ultimately I moved into animation. I became an animator. But I'd moved from architecture into filmmaking, and then ultimately animation, and I worked as an animator in Brisbane. I worked alone here actually from about 1976 until just recently as an animator.
And why did you decide to study architecture in the first place?
I grew up in North Queensland, and I think, to be honest, I had some facility for drawing. And there was one architect in Cairns. His name was Eddie Orabin, and Eddie was a really interesting person. Or the buildings that Eddie's name was attached to were interesting, and as a sort of an insecure, feckless sort of youth in the mid-60s in Cairns, there was something appealing about his work. And I had no idea what I would do at university. I had this facility for drawing, no formal art training or anything. But it seemed that somehow these things that Eddie Orabin had done and my interest in drawing could somehow mix. And
so how did you find out about Orabin's work? You just sought it out yourself, or somebody had pointed it out, or?
Well, because of the buildings, they were interesting. Yeah, they stood out in Cairns.
Are you talking about his own house and studio?
Yes, yeah. It was a really interesting house.
Which was very influenced by Frank Lloyd Wright.
That's right.
Did you?
I wouldn't have known that though. No, I wouldn't have known anything about that. But it was interesting, and I thought maybe that could be something I could pursue. I mean, apart from that, I really didn't have any great interest at all. I was interested in owning a Norton 650, which was a motorbike, and I was a fairly provincial lad, and I enrolled in architecture here.
And why did you? Because you had the choice between UQ and QUT at the time. QIT, yeah.
I don't know the answer to that one. I just think I turned up here. I probably was unaware of the QIT course. I turned up here and enrolled. I was accepted. And I started architecture. And the course for me was really interesting. It exposed me to new ideas, new perspectives, and I developed an interest in things outside of my regular diet, living up north.
So do you remember who taught you, and anyone in particular?
Well, there were, I do remember. The ones who stood out were Ian Cinnamon and Bill Carr. Perhaps later on, Peter O'Gorman, group of other lecturers there, but perhaps those three were influential for me. I say they were influential. I think Ian attempted to expose us to a liberal education. He tried to broaden or widen our interests in things outside the specific study of the built environment. And he made an effort to do this. One of the things that I think had an impact on me is that he would get films from the National Film Archive every week, and he would screen them.
What kind of films?
There were documentaries. There was a broad range of films. There were animated films. There were films about other design disciplines. And in terms of animation, I was aware, probably for the first time, I saw non-funny films as distinct from unfunny films. You know, my diet of animation up until that stage was probably about cats and mice battering each other. But these other films sort of, I think, began to, you know, started me scratching an aesthetic gland I didn't really know I had. And because of the other films that introduced us to other design disciplines, I became aware that this interest I had in drawing had applications beyond presenting plan and elevation, you know, the technical requirements of plan and elevation drawings. You know, they could be used in other ways. Ian also worked hard at trying to encourage us to transfer intellectual skills and practical skills to other disciplines. And I think he also, and you know, we all, I guess he also taught history, and through that we were introduced to the great modern architects, you know, all the great luminaries who existed. And with design projects, you would find yourself trying to mimic their styles, you know. You would concentrate on one luminary and try to understand what it was that you found interesting about the work, and you might mimic that in a design project. And from time to time, that luminary for me might change. Why? It doesn't really matter. It just did. But I would try to mimic their style out of this sort of instinctive conviction that fidelity was all important, you know, ironically.
So were you encouraged to do this, or did that?
I think the main encouragement was to think outside of our provincial existence. And one of the things that I think that happened was that most of us had little interest in the local. There was little value given to the local as distinct from the international. This is my view. And we learnt to throw, you know, from the tower where the faculty used to be, we could throw corrugated iron and Corbusier and Mies van der Rohe at everybody. We all learned how to do that. I don't think many of us really understood what modernism was. We seemed to recognise it when we saw it.
But you saw it more as a style than as a social program?
Yes, I think so. I think we saw it that way. And so Ian tried to introduce us to multiple disciplines. And I think he had a view about education. I think he wanted us to be adaptable. Maybe I didn't see it that way at the time, but on reflection I think he pushed a sense of adaptability. And on the other hand, the fellow Bill Carr I mentioned, I think he tried to engender a sense of social responsibility, that he pointed out to us that most of our parliamentarians, for example, were either lawyers or doctors or farmers, and that if anything was going to change with the built environment, then some of us needed to become active citizens and involve ourselves politically or socially in some way. And I think he got through to a few people. I mean, there was one of my contemporaries, Lecky Ord. She became the mayoress of Melbourne. There were maybe a couple of students who followed my year, but they became active on shire councils. Greg Bamford on the Noosa Shire comes to mind. And I think that had an effect, in town planning issues. But I attribute some of those things to someone like Bill Carr. It was, that was around 1968, and it was an exciting time of change. And we had our demonstrations on various issues here in Queensland, and people like that would actually march. We would fraternise more with the staff. We would get pissed with them. We would have a tutorial out in the bush somewhere. We became friends as much as they were our mentors. They served, I think, a really good mentoring role in a broad way.
How many students were there? Was it a big group or?
We probably had about 25 in our year. From memory, it would be something like that.
That you started with, and in fifth year they went?
Oh, they began culling them by second year. I don't know how many ended up. The other thing that happened, and I guess it's occurred to me from time to time, we used to have a 3-term teaching year, whereas now it's a 2-semester year. And I think there's a lot to be said for that 3-term year, because we would begin the year enthusiastically, and by the end of the first term you would sort of loosen up a bit and get involved in other sort of social issues. And then at the end of the second term you would start to think, I better get stuck into this again, and you would prepare yourself for a hard-working third term to complete the year. But in that second term, when I was a student, we used to have an architecture student review. I mean, it's all passé these days, but then it was an interesting part of my education. And in a way, it sort of extended what I was trying to say, I guess, about Ian Cinnamon, is that with those reviews, we did everything. We wrote, we acted, we had a band, we produced sets, we did everything. And unlike the witty drama arts faculty students who had their reviews and their drama events, ours tended to be more visual and appropriated from popular culture. And they were important to my development, I think, because they taught me a type of self-reliance.
Yeah, well, in retrospect, they were important cultural events anyway.
Yeah, but they came out of this. I would never have been involved with things like that if I hadn't been an architecture student. So they were a little outside of the university in some sense, but they emanated from this, and I think they carried with them the spirit of the way we behaved in studios and so on.
But you weren't disadvantaged by being part of that. You were encouraged to be part of that.
We were encouraged to be part of it, and I benefited enormously from it.
Mm.
I enjoyed being an architecture student because there was a social dimension to it as much as this sort of narrow focus on design issues. And I actually loved that. And my course was 3 years full-time, 3 years part-time. I found myself, when I was working part-time, the part-time course you had to find a job with a firm of architects, and then you'd come here and do evening classes. And I found myself working in a firm that, I don't know, it wasn't particularly exciting. It seemed to me.
Which one?
Douglas and Barnes, it was called. And I found the business of architecture had little appeal to me, and I found myself, and through the reviews too, headed towards filmmaking. And so I ultimately left the course and I went to the London Film School, and the thing that was interesting there is here in the architecture faculty, my view was the local was undervalued. Our focus was more on outsiders. And I had no experience of their work. But books told me they were interesting architects. And so I intellectualised this. Like much of my background, my education was based on imported information. All my literature was imported from outside. Our reading books and so on at school had English writers. The films I saw were American or British films. There was little local content, and yet I quite liked the people of my community, and I knew they were different from what I was experiencing, and yet we didn't have that sort of formal culture or the components that allowed us to be comfortable with them. And when I went to the film school in London, it was a truly international school. And there was a lot of cross-cultural fertilisation, which I think the internet gives everyone now, but back then it wasn't so easy. And so what Sanford did with his concubines in Sierra Leone, or what Ricardo did in Venezuela with geese, and what Noriyuki did on telling stories about the evils of international aid in Ceylon, I found really interesting. But what was particularly interesting to me is that they found my stories interesting. And mine were in a sort of form of storytelling, but I didn't have a great deal that I could show them from my part of the world. So it sort of reinforced in me that my community did have some value. The other thing that probably extended what I'd already started in architecture here was that at the film school we had to learn, because of this sort of international group, we had to try to find universal themes that we could tell visually. And that was something that I think had really started to begin with me here in the architecture course. So I valued it for those reasons. And when I came back...
When was that?
came back here in 1975.
Mm-hmm.
I ran into Don Watson, who was a year ahead of me in the course. But Don had been doing some research for the National Trust. It was one of those sort of Whitlam era projects. And he'd said that they'd gathered an enormous amount of data, but it really needed some sort of popular culture document in order to give locals access to that data. And so I took the opportunity to make a documentary, Timber and Tin, which I hoped presented a type of union of locals and their buildings and gave some sort of outlet for local expression. And so that emerged from that. Ultimately, I decided it was animation that I wanted to do, and then I started a little studio. But I in setting up that studio, I think I carried a lot of the simple principles. I think we were taught to do things with a ball of string and a few rubber bands and first principles. To be self-reliant and somehow find a way of making something happen. And architecture gave me that confidence, along with what I'd done at the film school with an international community. And so I established myself as an animator here. I was working alone as an animator here. It is interesting that there's a sort of cyclic thing that has happened. In the last sort of few years of my life, I found myself teaching history at QUT and making sure the local is well represented in that, given a context, and drawing. I ran a couple of drawing units as well. Now, I had never had any formal training, art training, but within this course we used to have life drawing classes as well. Now, I don't know if they still have those things here, but we had them, and they were very valuable to me. And they were local artists who would come in and run these life drawing classes. And again, they would involve us in their social activities. There was the Contemporary Art Society. We'd go and share evenings with them. I ran a couple of drawing units, and students still benefit from those classes. So there was a sort of legacy in that cycle.
You mentioned Peter O'Gorman. Can you elaborate what he meant to you?
Well, Peter was a fairly intense person, and I think Peter, one of those many tutorials where we'd all gather and take a bottle of wine and lumps of cheese or whatever, or bread, and go somewhere. Peter would introduce us to philosophical discussion. Existentialism was a big part of Peter's work. It was a common theme in his discussions, and not that any of us necessarily knew what the hell it meant at the time, but it was through people like that we began to engage with theory and philosophy. I think prior to that, most of the courses that we did, there wasn't an overt declaration of what was underpinning the topic. We just somehow, by osmosis, tried to figure that out.
There was no theory.
There was no theory underpinning our work. we would just pick this up.
Was Peter practising at that stage?
No, well, not to my knowledge. He may have been. Someone will catch me out, but it didn't seem that way.
So you
I mean, he taught us. He would get bogged down in construction at times. And sometimes that wouldn't necessarily. I'd just lose interest in it because he could just be so fastidious about the whole thing. But broadly, I got a lot out of Peter, just broad discussion about life.
If someone like Eddie Orabin had been teaching here, you would have related the kind of things you could see him doing. And
well, I'm not sure. I'm not even sure about that. I'm just saying that there was this excitement. I mean, what was I exposed to? I was exposed to literature from outside, films from outside, magazines from outside. A magazine that we all used to buy was Life magazine, and prior to that, Picture Post. But particularly Life magazine had lots of photographs of modern buildings in America. There was always something interesting about those to me. I would find myself looking at them and finding them interesting in some way. And Eddie's house appealed to me. As something very different. As something very different from anything else in Cairns. And so, I guess. There was this interest in wanting to find out what went on outside of my parochial background. So, things of interest seemed to happen elsewhere. That was a common theme in my life. Interesting things seemed to be happening elsewhere. Even when I came to Brisbane, the centres, the financial centres of Sydney and Melbourne seemed to be doing the things that the magazines wrote about. They didn't seem to write about stuff here.
When you went to Douglas and Barnes, though, I mean, they were doing some interesting things.
Were they?
That church at Indooroopilly, the Catholic church there.
They'd already done that. Yeah.
I mean, I don't know who was responsible, but I mean, it's light years away from anything else that was happening around here.
Yeah.
You didn't meet anyone in that firm that you could
relate to. I couldn't relate to them at all. And I guess, like architecture, even with filmmaking, when I went to the film school, I found that there were always sharks sort of swimming around, who were torn between that desire to do art and make money at the same time. And that was a tension that I always seemed to walk away from. I found that very difficult to feel comfortable in that environment.
So when you started your own business, how did you survive?
Yeah, well, it was exactly all those things, I mean, I had to somehow adapt to those things that I struggled with. And I had limited budgets, but an enthusiasm for wanting to make the animation happen, and just working out ways of trying to be resourceful and to do it on a limited budget.
So you came away from the London
Film School
as an animator, or you picked that up afterwards?
I had a bit of both. There were streams of the course that allowed me to do a bit more animation than the filmmaking, but animation is what grabbed me. I mean, I think in the end it's happened because my interest in drawing really began when I was a boy, and my father would write to me with illustrated letters, and that left a searing scar. The drawings were important to me, that he was able to say so much through simple drawings in his letters to me as a 7-year-old. That I think I started trying at an early age to draw without any formal training. And even when I started my little animation studio, I think a lot of my work, you pay a price when you don't do these formal courses. I'm sure a lot of my early work, the surface value of it suffers because of a lack of formal training in these things. But eventually you seem to get on top of it. You're wily enough to make things work.
So you would have had an income from television commercials?
Yes, television commercials is what sustained me. Yeah. That's what sustained me. Yeah. And then this desire to connect with an animation community that existed outside. I would try to make a short film to send to festivals, and that would sort of connect me with the broader community of animators outside.
So was this one, the Timber and Tin, was that the first that you sort of produced? Or?
Oh, well, that was the first project, but when I came back home, yeah. Yeah.
So did that go off to any festivals?
No, not to my knowledge. No. I mean, I think it's been shown. I mean, it was in the state film archives for years, and it went to just about every high school around Queensland. There were 6 prints, so they were shredded by the end. But I'd like to think that it was an interesting document at the time.
Yes.
But it didn't occur to me to be sending it at that stage, to be sending it anywhere. You know? It wasn't made for that purpose.
So when did you actually start doing that? What was the next film that you made that did?
Oh, well, they were then animated films that I made. Yeah, just.
What was the first one?
Well, the first one I sent around was one called Violet and Brutal. A tropical love story. It's interesting that the environment in which the little drama takes place is a timber house up on stumps, corrugated iron roof. And again, there was another one called Bird Brain. Similar imagery in that film. And there's another one called One Man's Instrument, about a banana farmer with development starting to encroach around his environment.
And did they have any sort of impact here or elsewhere?
Yeah, they were well received at festivals. Yeah, it put me in touch with a larger community, and I got to participate in some collaborative pieces. One was with a Canadian, and he invited 26 animators from around the world to do a type of, if you can remember from school days, a musical letter where you follow on from someone else's last line. Or someone else, a component of their drawing, that extends out into a larger drawing. Well, he designed the character, and you were sent the last drawing of someone else's sequence, and you animated ahead for 15 seconds, and then your final drawing was sent somewhere else. And that was a really interesting project. Another was, I guess, this active citizenry thing again. A Dutch animator used the Workers of the World anthem, the Internationale, and everyone contributed a short sequence to that. Yeah, you might as well stop here because I don't know where I'm going with any of this because I'm getting away from architecture. But
I have more questions.
Yes,
Can I go back to your architecture education for a minute?
Yeah,
You said
sure.
the interesting people were Ian Cinnamon and Bill Carr, and they were looking at modern buildings, international modern buildings. Were they also? My question is maybe twofold. Were they also showing the local modern buildings like Hayes and Scott and Burrell and Dalton, what they were doing? And also, were there other teachers there that were kind of an opposing force to Cinnamon, that were more in the traditional type of architectural education still around?
Yes, we were aware of people like Jim Burrell. Another one with domestic architecture was John Dalton. I guess he stood out as well. But there were others. Their names escape me. But
were they being shown? Were they pointed out to you during your education?
Yes, and a lot of those people would come in for an afternoon. You know, maybe during a studio session, they may come in and also set a small design project, but also sometimes talk about their projects. Or we'd go out on site and have a look at these things. But I'm not sure how we linked our projects to their work in any way. You know, they would come and they would talk. Pat Moroney might come and get us to design a barn. So we might all go out and look at barns, and we'd perhaps be an exercise in sort of looking at details and so on.
But would they, when they would come in and talk about their work, would they link their work to international examples, or would they say that it was their own creativity?
No, they didn't ever link their work to international examples. No, Ian introduced us to modernism. This is my memories of it, yes.
What did he think was good modernism?
Well, we'd talk at length about the Bauhaus, right? But you know, there are all the notable, all the luminaries in modern architecture. The Corbusier and Frank Lloyd Wright, and there were Mies van der Rohe and Gropius and so on. We'd see, you know, he'd put up slides and we'd look at these things. But we didn't have access to anything about work that happened in our part of the world. The other thing is that I don't think any of these people were researchers, in the sense that I don't think they ever contributed to journals or magazines. You know, we sort of learned in a vacuum.
Well, Birrell and Dalton certainly contributed written things.
Probably not until late in their careers. You know, John Dalton would how often would he have appeared in magazines on Australian architecture?
There was a magazine called Cross Section, which he was the correspondent for.
Yeah.
So he appeared regularly in that. I don't know how often it came out, but he was always.
Was that in the late 60s?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Oh well, I was probably ignorant of all these things.
Birrell wrote a book on Walter Burley Griffin.
Yeah. Okay.
And had it published. And I'm not quite sure what the date of that is, but I mean, these people were.
Well, that's commendable. That's commendable. I mean, but I wasn't aware of that spirit of research, of contribution to international journals and so on, from our part of the world.
You were with quite an interesting group of students. Can you talk about that group?
Well, I think it was a spirited time. There were big social changes anyway. And there was a sort of brashness, I think, with the group, and several of them moved on into other disciplines. Some into music, some became fine artists. well, Ralph Tyrrell was, I guess he pursued music. Peter Cox, filmmaking. Ross Gilbert went to Art College in Sydney. Well, behind me there was Ian Smith, who became an artist. Who were some of the others who...
Bruce Gardner?
Yeah, he completed his course, didn't he? Did he complete his course?
Was he the only one? He finished up in the government,
did
I
he?
think.
Yeah. I think most of them actually completed the course. I didn't, or Ross didn't. I'm not sure, but I think Ralph probably did.
No. Ralph Tyrrell.
Didn't finish?
No.
Okay. But, well, I think we were stimulated to this idea of transferring intellectual skills and practical skills over multiple disciplines seemed to be a part of our education here.
So did you have to work for architects to get enough money to go to London and go to the film school?
Yeah.
So did you work for them here in Brisbane? Or?
I worked with Douglas and Barnes, but I just wanted to get out.
Was that the only firm you worked for?
Yes. Yeah, I just did.
You stayed there long enough.
I stayed there long enough to earn enough to get out. Yeah.
And when did you get out? What year?
I left in 1970. 1970.
As did I.
Oh, did you?
Yeah.
Okay. Did you finish your course?
Not at that stage. I
No.
finished it later.
Yeah.
I went up to fourth year and then I took off.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I left then in 1970, and well, I took over your flat in Coronation Drive.
So you did.
Yeah. So we were there for about 6 months before we left.
That's right.
Yeah.
So you were in Brisbane when this student conference was taking place in 1967? That Gio Ponti came out for?
Yes.
Do you remember anything about that?
There was
or the
one.
events that took place around it?
It was the chicken episode.
There was the chicken episode.
And the strippers. I mean.
Yes. Well, there was a theatrical presentation in those times called A Happening.
And where did that
People
take place?
staged happenings. There was an anarchic spirit to these presentations where anything might happen, but they were loud, they were visual, they would have people on edge, and I remember for that conference, I think it was the University of Sydney said that they would be staging a happening here and for us to arrange facilities for them. And so we booked the Rialto Theatre. But we were always cynical about outsiders as well. You know, for all this interest in outsiders, there was also a healthy dose of cynicism. And I think that in a mischievous way, we thought we'd disrupt their happening, because it all seemed like it wasn't really a happening. It had a very formal structure to it. You know, we had to arrange a couple of strippers, and it was all a bit ho-hum. And they wanted a car put on stage, and they had a band, and they had all sorts of demands. And we went along with it, but just a couple of us thought that we might try to disrupt it. And look, it is a bit shameful to even reflect on it, but you've provoked it. But I remember a friend of myself, we went out to a poultry farm and we bought a coop of chickens, and we smuggled them into the back of the theatre, and at some point during the performance we launched these chickens from the balcony in the theatre. Mm. And it wasn't very well appreciated, and neither should it be, but Gio Ponti stormed out, and we had to confront the Senate at the university and explain ourselves. And an unpleasant blot on my background, I guess, but...
And what else do you remember from the student conference apart from the happening? Do you remember any of the lectures that were given?
I think there was a fellow, Tony William,
Mm-hmm.
yes, with his inflatable structures. And I guess it was sort of interesting in some way.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, it was different, it was exciting. I'm not sure. I mean, we were happy to be exposed to fresh concepts, and he had a bit of style, and his presentations were vaguely interesting, but no, I can't remember a great deal of the conference at all, apart from the chickens, which, I'd rather you not.
Well, we heard from other people about the chickens, so...
Okay.
But Tony William was coming from London, where
he came from London, and he was interesting, and it exposed us to a different form of architecture school, and that was interesting. As for his inflatable domes, I don't know. Well, for several weeks, everyone was making geodesic brown paper. Structures and blowing them up in the Great Court, and so it was fascinating. But there was a type of brevity to it all. You know what I mean? I'm not sure what the substance was. It was interesting. Yeah. That's about all I could say. I mean, it was interesting, but I'm not sure that we necessarily used it in some constructive way.
Did you go to any other student conferences?
No. No. Finance was always a struggle for me. I found it always difficult to raise funds for these trips. You know, I think the year before it may have been in Perth, and Buckminster Fuller was the guest. Actually, there is one thing I think it is worthwhile saying about the architecture course. I have always struggled to understand why the course. I think it's because it's subjective. People's work is judged, publicly judged. And I have never known a course, and I have taught in universities, I've never known a course where people can suffer from that judgment. You could study engineering, you could study law, you could do any other course and fail, or just decide that you weren't suited, and still walk around with your senses. People could start architecture and fail and have a breakdown, and feel absolutely worthless. And I think it is that subjective quality of the course, because you're being judged publicly. You know, work is put up on the wall and everyone is there to critically analyse it. And I guess when you're young, you perhaps don't have the confidence to necessarily argue. It takes some time to be able to do that. I found that was an interesting part of filmmaking as well. But people didn't necessarily end up in lunatic asylums as a result, you know. But, when I was at the film school, there was an anarchic spirit to the place, and people had to argue hard for their ideas. That was a really positive aspect of the film course, and I guess it was something that maybe the early years here, none of us had that type of confidence to argue strongly for our necessarily for our ideas.
Do you think by the end of the course you did? Is that the intention, that you would have confidence?
Perhaps it was, but nevertheless, I still feel that architecture has that as it's an awkward aspect of architectural education. That someone who might want to move on to something else, or someone who simply, for all the broadness of the liberal education that this place used to offer, I don't know if it still does, but it used to offer. For those who were okay at design, there was a sort of an irony to all that, because they tended to therefore be judgmental about other people. If their work was considered okay, it seemed to give them the right to be judgmental. And there is nothing so tedious as being with a group of architects with an ego,
Yes.
Where they feel that they have a right to socially diminish people,
So did anyone?
And that is ironical, considering the liberal education, where I guess some of the values of that are open-mindedness and greater tolerance and all those things,
So did anyone have a breakdown that you are aware of?
Oh, there were several, several. Yeah.
Nobody in your year had a breakdown, Robert?
Oh, they probably did. I probably didn't know about it.
Yeah.
I mean, people left.
Yeah.
And you never knew why.
Yeah.
I mean, we started off with a couple of hundred, and
Did you? Yeah.
they left. They were there for the wrong reasons.
Yes. Yeah, but you could do that with most of the other courses offered in this institution, and not feel necessarily bad about yourself if you failed something. Like you could fail structural mechanics or something like that.
And don't
so
care.
what? Just do it again. Repeat it next year. But if you fail design.
Yeah, but it's something very personal, design.
That's right. Yeah.
And then when it's criticized, I think it's very hurtful.
Yes. Yeah. So I think it's a difficult part of the course for people. I'm not saying I suffered from that. I'm just saying I saw people suffer from it, and I found that. It's just always been one of those things. I thought, well, maybe that's it. It's just that it's subjective, it's personal, and it's open to public ridicule and criticism. And for those who are exalted, they can be tiresome in their judgments of other things.
Who were those who were exalted in your year?
Well, I don't know. I guess there were people from my year who perhaps have done some outstanding work. Russell Hall was in my year. Rex Addison. Margie West, who went to Harvard in here. She may have taught the course here and then perhaps was given a scholarship or something. I'm not quite sure how that happened, but she ended up going to Harvard when she finished here, maybe to do a master's or something. I don't know where Margie is now.
She worked in the public service here, I think.
Okay.
I think everyone in the public service has just been made redundant. So
that's right.
That's the end.
I think the whole department is finished, isn't it? Yeah.
Willie Young, you didn't mention, but he was ahead of you, I guess.
Yeah, Willie was ahead of me. Willie. I mean, he did complete the course, but he then went to NIDA, and yes, he transferred his abilities to other things. Yeah, very successfully.
Roger O'Sullivan.
Yes.
Doug
Well, he was ahead of me. Who?
Doug Mackay.
But Doug didn't stay with architecture?
Yeah, he did. And so did Peter O'Sullivan. I mean, they both finished up working as architects.
Oh, okay.
Sydney, though.
Okay. But they were well ahead of me.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah, Willie was about 4 years ahead of me. And I'm still in touch with Will. I mean, we went to the same school, actually, in Cairns. But, yeah, no, I'm still in touch with Will. And, yeah, he's an important figure in, as a writer, as a gay man, as a whole range of things.
Well, he did some pretty wonderful slide events too, of his pictures as a photographer. Do you think we're there?
I think we're there. Unless you have another question to ask.
I probably do, but I'm just...
I don't know that. I'm thinking here and wondering if I've said anything that's relevant here to your field
absolutely.
of study.
I
But,
mean, you've been able to sort of describe the course in such a clear way that I don't think anyone's been able to do that before.
So far, no.
I mean, you only mentioned 3 of the tutors who had influence on you. What about the ones like Professor Cummings? Did he have any?
we had no.
Contact?
They were the sorts of people that I could never penetrate. I could never connect with. People like Professor Cummings. There
Bruce
was
Lucas.
Bruce Lucas. Marcus Kyle. Marcus Kyle.
Stan Marcus Kyle.
Hamish Murison.
Yeah.
They were all dry people, you know. I mean, I'm being cynical, but they weren't people I could necessarily connect with. And Graham DeGrucci was another person.
And what was their...
I had no real connection with them. And
how did they relate to Insulin and Bill Carr in the department? Was there animosity between those two groups, or was it they just was conviviality and neutral?
Yeah, well, I think they lived their separate lives.
Because they must have had different opinions on what an architecture education should be.
Yeah, I mean, Ian would throw parties. We'd all go to his place and fill his house and have a party. It was just as important in our education as being in the design studio. To spend the night at Ian's place or Bill Carr's. I remember one demonstration, I'm not sure whether it was Bill Carr who bailed my wife out. Do you know what I mean? There was a genuine social connection with them. They were genuine mentors. There was an aloofness with the other group that you're talking about. It was school, school teacher stuff. They didn't necessarily empathise with students at all. They did their job and tended to be technicalities.
So do you think when you start setting up as an animator and you have an office, do you run that office in any way like an architectural practice? I mean, you get people...
There were a lot of... actually, there were quite a few parallels with the nature of animation in some ways, with the business of animation and that of architecture. I mean, I used to think of, say, renovations to a house or a little extension or something. You might do the titles for a film as a sort of comparison. A television commercial might be a bit like doing a domestic dwelling.
But I mean, you were employing
and then you've
people.
got a larger project like a feature film, which you can't do on your own. You've got to set up a plant, and you've got to have many people.
So you became instrumental in training people at the same time?
Yes, because there weren't tertiary courses in animation when I started. So you would have students, or you would get people to, who demonstrated an interest, and then you would.
They'd probably find.
They'd learn from you. You would encourage them. You would encourage them to bring a lot of themselves to whatever it was they were doing as well.
But you wouldn't have to advertise for them. They'd find you.
Yes.
By reputation.
Well, they'd find you, and courses began. There are thousands of people doing animation in Brisbane now.
Yeah.
They're doing games, there are university courses. Yes, it's all changed. And the internet has changed that cross-cultural fertilisation that I don't think happened, I suppose, when I'm talking about the local and the international. That didn't happen for us, I felt. Even though John Dalton might have contributed to some magazine. In general, there wasn't this cross-cultural fertilisation. That was the way I felt about it. And I sort of always was looking for, well, why should it happen in some other place? I just felt that the local was swamped by in fact, the dominant culture, which in a way was just as parochial as my view about the local here. If I pick up an iPhone now, when you first light the window up, you've probably got, I mean, last week I noticed it was Groundhog Day. Tomorrow is Abe Lincoln's birthday, you know? So what's that all about? Is that the dominant culture that, oh, okay, no, well mine's not one of those. Okay. Mine is, I don't even know what mine is. It comes up with a blue window to start with. You know what I mean? And then you slide the things up. But it just says Abe Lincoln's birthday. Well, okay. Is that not the dominant culture that pervades?
It's very disappointing these days. We get obituaries in the Courier Mail about people who live in Washington or somewhere that you've never heard in your life. It's just because it's all syndicated. So I'm not sure it's any better today than it was, but at least we do.
I am trivialising, but what I'm saying is that the internet has changed that cross-cultural fertilisation, and it is different. And
the institutions probably do have a different view about what's happening here now. At least they try and teach it. Of course they do. And in our day they didn't teach it because they weren't capable. It was too difficult. No one had done the research. No one was probably. No,
but our eyes were elsewhere. And there was a cringe about the local. There was definitely a cringe about the local. When, in my case, going to an international school in London exposed me to the fact that people were interested in my stories.
But you came back.
And I came back, but one of the reasons was that I knew that there were people from my community who I loved as storytellers. But they were never taken seriously. And I just felt that I appreciated their sensibilities and their world, and I liked it.
And did you collaborate with any of those people when you came back?
So, I mean, a lot of them were just seen as yarn spinners. And very few people, when I came to university, very few people had published a book, had written a novel, had a novel published here in Queensland. Rodney Hall had some poetry published. Kath Walker had published a few, maybe a book of poetry. There might have been a couple of journalists working for the Courier Mail who'd published some poetry. Xavier Herbert was working on Poor Fellow My Country up north. But, we really didn't have local writers. You knew they were there. I mean, now, how many people have won the Vogel Award from Brisbane? You know what I mean? Our stories travel well, and the same way as the architecture travels well. There's a form of architecture from here that people come here to look at.
Yeah.
They didn't before.
That's probably got something to do with the confidence that we've
we've developed. Yeah, sure.
Do you remember Dennis Pryor?
No.
I remember him, I'm not sure where he came from, South Australia I think, but he came and addressed something at Contemporary Arts Society that we all went to.
Right, yeah.
Thought he was on top.
Yeah.
But, I mean, we had a very restrictive government at that time, and that was another reason for me leaving, in feeling that we just needed to go somewhere where they thought differently.
Yeah.
And I guess it was the same for all of us, and I guess 1968 was the time when you were aware that you know, there was people questioning all of those things elsewhere, not here, or not to the same extent.
Yeah, I mean, it was important to me that literature began to appear about, you know, that literature came from where I lived, about all sorts of subjects, because we'd been fed this imported diet. Books had told us what was good and what wasn't, and we intellectualised life rather than actually experience it. I'd never experienced modern architecture.
Did you ever afterwards, after you left the country, did you seek out anything?
Well, I went and looked at things, but I mean, it's like when I went to the film school, there was a lunchtime talk the first time I was there. It just happened to be Alfred Hitchcock. And there was a mythical figure in my life. I'd seen the films, but here am I, sitting in the same room. I could have asked a question. I didn't, but he was making Frenzy in London at the time, you know, and there he was, a lunchtime talk. And so the myths started to break down, that you saw these people as real people. And I grew up with real people, but they weren't represented in formal culture. So I guess the cycle for me was this course focused me on things outside. I went looking for that outside and realised that the local had an important value. And that was my sort of epiphany in you know, following that path. That the local had value.
Well, I think you were able to explain that with great clarity. So thank you.
Okay. Well.